In this video, we're going to be talking about respiration and in particular the respiratory system. So a few key things to understand about the respiratory system is that it is split into the upper and lower respiratory system. Another key thing to understand is that the respiratory system is the site that controls airflow starting at the nasal cavity and going all the way to the alveoli in the lungs. Air will enter generally through the nasal cavity to start. Air will go through this nasal cavity, and following this, air will go to the pharynx, and then from the pharynx, air will go to the larynx, and then the trachea. From the trachea itself, air will go to the right and left bronchi. Just to go over this, the pharynx is like a muscular tube located between the nose and mouth. The larynx is actually the voice box itself, and the trachea is the windpipe. Now, a key thing to actually understand about the trachea is that the trachea contains cartilage around it to keep it open. Now we're going to go over the branching and subdivision that occurs following the right and left bronchi. The trachea, again, it'll branch off into the left and right bronchi. And just to clarify something that we mentioned earlier, the right and left bronchi actually make up what is called the primary bronchus. The airflow following the primary bronchus will actually divide it 22 more times, and it'll terminate in a cluster of alveoli. Primary bronchi, which remember is the left and right bronchi. Air will travel to the secondary bronchus. And then from the secondary bronchus, air will flow through to the bronchiole. And finally, it will terminate in a cluster of alveoli. So yeah, just to highlight that process one more time, it'll go from the primary bronchi, and then it'll go through to the secondary bronchus, the bronchiole, and then finally the alveoli. Now, some interesting things to just understand is that the smooth muscle cells are actually present around the bronchiole, which is this section here. And what these smooth muscles do is that they control the opening and closing of the bronchiole, which controls airflow. Finally, the alveoli itself has pores where gas exchange occurs. So following all this branching process, I did actually want to go over the actual structure of the lungs themselves. So we'll go over the right lung and the left lung. The right lung has the superior lobe, the middle lobe, and the inferior lobe. The left lung also has the superior lobe. However, it does not have a middle lobe because it has a specific cardiac notch accommodating for the heart. It does, however, have an inferior lobe. Okay, that's just a really brief explanation of the structure of the lungs. I just wanted to go over that before I moved on to the process of gas exchange. So gas exchange essentially refers to the uptake of oxygen and the discharge of CO2. I'll say, uptaking. Another key thing to actually understand about gas exchange is the idea of partial pressure. So a particular gas within a mixture of gases will exert a pressure, because all gases will exert some sort of pressure, and this particular gas's pressure that it exerts is called the partial pressure. And knowing partial pressure of a gas essentially allows us to predict its movement, as gases will always move from a region of high to low partial pressure. Now I'm going to be going over the pressure of negative pressure breathing. So to move oxygen from the atmosphere into the lungs, the pressure must be lower in the lungs. It's a pulling motion rather than pushing air into our lungs, we're pulling air into our lungs. And this is essentially achieved by expansion of the chest wall by muscle contraction. So let me actually just write that down just to make that really clear. Pressure must be lower in the lungs. So yeah, pressure must be lower in lungs than external as air is being pulled into the lungs. Yeah, and this is achieved through the expansion of the chest wall through contraction. Now the question is, why do our lungs actually expand when the chest contracts? And it's a really important idea to understand that a double membrane surrounds the lungs. One side adheres to the outside of the lungs, and this is called the parietal pleura, and the other side will adhere to the wall of the thoracic cavity, and this is called the visceral pleura. The pleural fluid, which is between these two regions. It's what sticks them together via hydrogen bonds, and it ensures that lungs will contract as the diaphragm contracts. It surrounds the lungs. And this is called the parietal pleura, the side that adheres to the outside, adheres to the wall of the thoracic cavity. And this is called the visceral pleura. The pleural fluid between the parietal and visceral pleura is what sticks these membranes together via hydrogen bonding, and this just ensures that the lungs contract as the diaphragm contracts. So pleural fluid. So the process of negative pressure breathing is that pressure must be lower in lungs than the external environment, as air is being pulled into the lungs, not pushed. This is achieved by the chest wall contracting by muscle contraction. Now, how does this contraction process actually occur? Well, the double membrane that surrounds the lungs, one side adhering to the outside, the parietal pleura, and one side adhering to the thoracic cavity, the visceral pleura, are stuck together with pleural fluid that essentially ensures contraction, and it sticks them together via hydrogen bonding, and it ensures they contract as the diaphragm contracts. Maybe I didn't mention this before, but the diaphragm is essentially a band of skeletal muscle that allows for breathing as it contracts. That's the process of negative pressure breathing. Now we're going to be talking about how does breathing out, the expiration process, actually occur compared to the inhalation process. It's actually a very passive process, and it actually involves the relaxation of the diaphragm and the rib cage, reducing the volume of the thoracic cavity, driving air out of the lungs. So relaxes diaphragm. Another idea that I wanted to kind of go over in a bit more detail is the actual gas exchange that occurs at the alveoli. Human lungs contain millions of alveoli, and this creates a huge surface area. This allows for oxygen to rapidly diffuse across the membrane into the surrounding capillaries for dispersal across the body. It allows for oxygen to rapidly diffuse across the membrane into surrounding capillaries for dispersal around the body. But there's actually two types of alveolar cells. So there's the alveolar cell, which is responsible for gas exchange and actively interacts with the closely related capillary. And there's the type 2 alveolar cell, which synthesizes surfactant. So type 1 actively interacts with its closely related capillary to facilitate the dispersal of oxygen around the body. Type 2 alveolar cell synthesizes surfactant, which actually lowers the surface tension of the alveoli, preventing water from sticking together, which would cause the actual alveoli to collapse. So it synthesizes surfactant. Okay, yeah, so gas exchange at the alveoli. The large alveolar numbers create a large surface area. This allows for oxygen to rapidly diffuse across the membrane into surrounding capillaries for dispersal across the body. There's two types of alveolar cells, the type 1 cell, which interacts with its closely related capillary to facilitate that dispersal of oxygen process, and type 2 alveolar cells, which synthesize surfactant, which lowers the surface tension of the alveoli and prevents water from sticking together, preventing alveoli from collapsing. Okay, the next really important thing we're going to be talking about is gas transport and CO2. Oxygen is predominantly transported around the body down to hemoglobin, which is within red blood cells, and 98% of oxygen is transported this way and 2% is transported in plasma blood. Just to make clear, 98% is transported this way and 2% is transported dissolved in plasma blood. Now, moving on to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is transported actually by three different mechanisms. So 93% is within red blood cells, but it's in two different ways. So 23% is bound to hemoglobin, and 70% is actually converted to bicarbonate. One method. So 23% is hemoglobin, 70% is converted to bicarbonate, the other 7% is dissolved in plasma. Why this conversion into bicarbonate is particularly important is because it's essentially a method for the respiratory system to respond, facilitating a greater breathing response or relaxing more. So there's a reaction that occurs between CO2 and water. and yeah, this reaction goes both ways. And it's facilitated by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. So I'm just going to say Ca, and it forms HCO3 minus and hydrogen ions. Now, pH will change as the concentration of H plus ions increases. The greater the amount of CO2 reacting, the more H plus ions that will be present, and thus the greater pH change that will occur. So this is how the respiratory system regulates and facilitates its response, through responding to the amount of H plus ions produced through this carbon dioxide reacting. So the greater, hopefully that makes sense. So the greater the CO2, the greater the amount of H plus ions, and thus the greater the pH change. And this is due to H plus causing a more acidic environment. The greater the CO2, the respiratory system will actually be driven to breathe more, which will actually facilitate more carbon dioxide being exhaled. So this is what facilitates breathing rates, the presence of carbon dioxide. Okay, hopefully that made sense. That's a really important process to understand of how the respiratory system actually regulates whether it should breathe more or relax more. It's all due to the presence of carbon dioxide and its impact on changing concentration of hydrogen ions, which impacts the pH. Okay, just to explain this little diagram that I quickly just drew up, this is the process of how partial pressure impacts the direction of airflow. So to start off with the dry air, the normal atmospheric pressure is around 760 millimeters of mercury. Just to clarify before we go in, what millimeters of mercury actually means, it's a unit of pressure, and it's essentially based on how high a column of mercury would be pushed up in the air. The partial pressure of oxygen in this case is 160, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 0.23 millimeters of mercury. Now, inside the alveoli itself, after the humidification and mixing with residual air, the partial pressure of oxygen is 100 millimeters of mercury, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 40 millimeters of mercury. And this is the partial pressure of gases ready to diffuse into the blood. We'll talk about the actual gas exchange that occurs in the arterial blood. And this just shows the successful gas exchange in lungs, as the partial pressure is around 100 millimeters of mercury and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 40 millimeters of mercury. So it matches the alveoli, as this shows successful gas exchange in lungs. Now, once we reach the cell level, the partial pressure is less than or equal to 40 millimeters of mercury, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is greater than or equal to 46 millimeters of mercury. So cells actually will use up oxygen for metabolism, which is why it decreases from the arterial blood to the cell level, and cells will produce CO2 as waste, which is why the CO2 is actually increased from the cell level in comparison to the arterial blood. So oxygen diffuses from blood into cells, and CO2 diffuses from cells into blood. Now let's go back into the venous blood, which is blood returning from the tissues to the lungs, and the partial pressure of oxygen in this case, this is meant to be less than or equal to, it's a bit unclear, but it's less than or equal to 40 millimeters of mercury, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is greater than or equal to 46 millimeters of mercury. So this is deoxygenated blood, high in carbon dioxide and low in oxygen. That may have seemed like a lot of information, but just a quick summary. So alveoli will fill air with the partial pressure of 100 and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide of 40. The oxygen will diffuse into the arterial blood, the same gas pressures as the alveoli, as the gas pressures don't change between the alveoli and the arterial blood. The arterial blood will deliver oxygen to cells and will pick up the CO2, and this is why this oxygen is used at the cell level and carbon dioxide is produced, which is why the oxygen amount in millimeters of mercury decreases, whereas the carbon dioxide amount in millimeters of mercury increases. Venous blood section, venous blood will return to lungs, which is low on oxygen and high in CO2. And in the lungs, carbon dioxide is exhaled and oxygen is taken in, and this cycle continues to repeat. So this is a cycle of how partial pressure influences gas movement. Both carbon dioxide and oxygen will always move from a high partial pressure to low partial pressure. And this pressure gradient, this difference in partial pressure, is actually what drives diffusion. I know that may seem like a lot of information, but that's actually the end of the video. Hopefully this video helped you understand the process of respiration and partial pressure and how all these different processes within the body work together to facilitate the respiration process. I hope you learned something from this video, and that's all we're going to cover in this one.